So this morning, I'm delighted to welcome Alpa Shah and Jens Lerche. Alpa is a professor in the Department of Anthropology here at LSE, and Jens is a reader in Agrarian and Labour Studies in the Department of Development Studies at SOAS. They're going to be talking about their ethnographic research into migrant labour in India, what it revealed about the problem and how to tackle it. So the talk today is based on a paper that was published in the Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers Journal, and it was their most cited paper in 2020 of the journal, in spite of the fact that neither of them are geographers. So it's an amazing achievement, and it is a paper that has had policy impact. So looking forward to the talk, and at the end of the session we should have time for some questions which we'll take via the chat. But for now, I will hand over to Alpa and Jens. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Louise, and hi everybody. Welcome to the LSE. I thank the LSE Research Division for doing this series and for inviting us to present our work. I thank Jens Lerche, with whom I've written this paper, which is based on our joint work leading an ESRC and an ERC research grant. And what we're going to do is we're going to go behind some of the scenes which maybe some of you might have been familiar with, and we're going to Jens, may we have the next slide, please? And yeah, if you remember in March 2020, on our news screens we had these astonishing images coming from India. So this was when the COVID lockdowns were called, and in India they were called on the 24th of March, and Indians had like about 4 hours to get themselves ready for the whole entire nation to go into lockdown. And something astonishing happened, which was that millions of people took to the streets, going from the cities like Delhi, and going, marching thousands and thousands of kilometers with all their belongings on their backs and on their shoulders, going home. And our news screens were taken up with these like long lines of people just taking to their feet as the lockdowns were called. And these people were basically migrants, internal migrants, who, and many of them seasonal migrants, so migrating for just a part of the year to work in factories, in warehouses, to work in construction work for a few months of the year to make a living. And what they were doing is they were going back to their homes because they were worried about being able to survive under lockdown in their migrant places. And whilst this was happening, we were finishing a paper on internal migration in India, which actually I think revealed a whole hidden history, hidden sociology, hidden anthropology of this migrant labor, which was in some ways revealed to us on plain sight when in plain sight when the migrants took to their feet. And so what we want to talk about in this paper is what enables these migrants to work and to produce for this nation which is aspiring to be a superpower, what enables the economy to run, and these are things that we don't often see, don't often talk about. And so that's what we're going to talk about in this paper, the informal economies of care, which is what we call them, and how they are central to understanding the inequalities which lie at the heart of labor migration. Yes, may we have the next slide, please? So, this is migrant labor, which is working at the bottom of all kind of labor relations in the economy. This is migration. So we often think about international labor migrants, which in the world, the International Labor Organization of the UN says that there are 164 international labor migrants in the world. These are people who cross over borders, whether it's Mexicans, in the US, or whether it is Eastern European migrants in the old days in England. But what we don't often talk about is internal labor migrants, and this actually makes up even more people in the world, which are estimated to be in China alone 280 million people, in India 100 million people. And this is migrant labor, which is really, as I said, at the bottom of the pile of all labor relations. So this is migrant labor, which is, they're paid the lowest wages, they work the longest hours, they have the worst jobs, which nobody else wants to do. And when they migrate, they're treated in the places that they go to as second-class citizens. They don't often have the same citizenship rights. They don't have access to health care. They are much more exploited than even the local labor. So and it's very hard for them to form solidarity with local labor, and they have very few rights to organize, and to fight their conditions. But this is the labor that enables, our economies to function. This is the labor whose value is not counted, who get remunerated very little, but is enabling, the kind of capitalist growth we have today across the world. So what we're looking at is what enables this migrant labor to migrate. What are all the hidden costs that we don't take into account? And we came to these conclusions, and what we're going to reveal to you today, when we both of us had been working in various ways on migrant labor, but then we read this project, which was funded by major grants from the ERC and the ESRC, in which we and a team of postdoctoral researchers based here at the LSE, but there was a very close collaboration with SOAS, where Jens is based, where different postdoctoral researchers lived in different parts of India, and they looked at different parts of the economy and what the labor at the bottom of those hierarchies was doing. So whether it was the tea plantations of Kerala or chemical factories in Tamil Nadu, and everywhere we found migrant labor in those locations doing the worst work. And so our research was published. The bulk of the research was published in a book called Ground Down by Growth: Tribe, Caste, Class and Inequality in 21st Century India. And you can see the names of all the authors who are the postdocs, and us: Richard Axelby, Dalal Benbabali, Brendan Donegan, Jessalyn Raj and Vikramditya Thakur. So this is a collaborative project, and people worked in different parts of the country. And I'm going to hand over to Jens now to tell you a little bit about some of those sites and the circumstances of migrant labor that we found there.
Thanks, Alpa, and it's great to see so many people here. Yes, indeed, the research program worked in these 5 places that you can see on the map. What we looked at there was, as Alpa said, the position of different groups of laborers, including migrant laborers. Importantly, we looked at the ones at the bottom of the pile, bottom of society, which in India are the Dalits and the Adivasis. Dalits are the ex-untouchable castes at the bottom of the social and economic hierarchy, and Adivasis are the indigenous population. Altogether, they make up 25% of the population in India, so a huge chunk that are very much at the bottom of the system. So we looked at that in these 5 different places. Let me just give you a taster of some of the places.
May I say one thing before you carry on, Jens? Yeah, just to remind you, as Louise said, neither of us are geographers where this article was published, but we work from an anthropology department. I'm an anthropologist, and Jens works with very ethnographic techniques. And so the idea was that each of us were based in these sites for more than a year, living amongst the local population. And it's because we were living amongst the local population for such a long period of time that we were able to see, the way in which migrant labor circulates and what is like hidden from everybody when you normally go to these places. So yeah, what we're going to present is really based on anthropological ethnographic research, the strength of anthropology. Yeah.
Thanks, Alpa. Though we cannot give you much detail on that within these 25 minutes that we have, so I will simply tell you a couple of the main findings in the different places as tasters for what it was that we looked into. In the tea plantations of Kerala, one of the places in southern India where we worked, there the manual labor had for long been done by Dalits, so the ex-untouchable castes. But what happened under very poor conditions, low pay, etc., etc. But what happened during the last 10, 20 years, where even these conditions were undercut when the plantation owners introduced seasonal migrant laborers, Adivasi from central India, to work in the plantation on worse terms and conditions even than the Dalit laborers. We saw the same in Tamil Nadu, still South India, where we worked in the chemical industrial belt in Cuddalore. There, it was also Dalits that did the most menial jobs in the production. They were working with cow carcasses in the production. But when they, at a certain point, started to take action and demand better conditions of work, the management again brought in seasonal migrants from central and eastern India to undercut them and undercut their action. And these seasonal migrants are still there working under conditions that are even worse. In fact, the seasonal migrants from central India were also present in the high Himalayas where we worked as well. There, again, it was the worst, the most arduous kind of work that was taken on by them. They did the road construction in the high Himalayas. Adivasis from central India, from Jharkhand, worked there under appalling conditions in the cold, whereas the local groups at the bottom of the social hierarchy, tribal groups, had to go elsewhere, had to start to go elsewhere to find work. And so a pattern repeated itself across these sites very clearly. Now, it isn't just that the conditions of work are that seasonal migrants are able to get are worse than the local population, that they undercut them there. It is also that their whole life while they migrate is a good deal worse. For example, if we're looking at how migrant laborers live, here we have examples from our Western Indian field site, where the Adivasi workers from there migrated to the sugarcane fields and lived in the shacks. You can see it to the left here, and to the right we have the shacks that Adivasi workers, also from central India, worked in when they worked at brick factories on the North Indian plains, in an area where I have worked. No sanitation, no running water, etc., etc. And I will hand over to you again, Alpa.
Just to add to a couple of things Jens has said, so remember, like these laborers, we talked about sugarcane fields, we talked about tea plantations, we talked about brick factories. These people are doing the work that is giving us sugar here in England, or that is giving us tea here in England, you know. So this is like really, or constructing the infrastructure for the new economy. So this is really like crucial work, which is, and it has global implications. So we're really looking at the very bottom of the labor chain. And what's important to also note is that this migrant labor that is being brought, they're only being brought for a portion of the year. So sometimes 6 months, sometimes 8 months. And then when the rains come in the monsoon, they have to return back to their villages. So they can't stay in their sites of migration, and they'll keep moving. They'll be sent to, different kind of sites. Every year it might be a different place that they go to. So all that's needed is just their bodies, right? The labor of their bodies. And what Jens has also been highlighting throughout these slides is that most of this migrant labor, we worked in all of these different sites across the country, but this migrant labor that we found in all of these sites was coming from central and eastern India. So these are the hilly, forested regions of India, which are some of the poorest parts of the country, poorest parts of the world, if you look at poverty indices. Yet, of course, they're very rich as well. They've got mineral reserves. So India's largest mineral reserves are underneath these lands, and multinational corporations of every hue are trying to get into these lands and mine these lands and displace the people from the lands, get rid of the people. And so in these areas, there is an intense, more or less a war going on. In the name of terrorism, the state has kind of militarized all of these areas and tried to dispossess the low caste, the Adivasi people, the indigenous people from these lands. And these are areas where I have done, lived for 4.5 years doing ethnographic field research, and you see these pictures from my sites where you've got mining, you've got counter-terrorist insurgency. And so it's people from these areas which are being, thrown out to different parts of the country doing work at the lowest end of the economy, but they can't stay in those places for all the year. They have to return back to their homes for a part of the year. And that's what, that process of what sustains this labor is what we're looking at in this paper. Yeah, here now, you see the conditions, you've seen the houses they live in, you can see the conditions under which they migrate. I mean, those pictures of, hundreds of people like sitting, like sometimes you can literally get a Jeep with 100 people sitting on it, hanging off on it. And, you have to, like, when you're on your journeys, when you're in one of those Jeeps, you literally have to, your little bottom will have a little tiny space on the seat, and completely squashed. But yeah, these are the conditions under which people are migrating. And what I want to highlight is the thing that we highlight in this paper is that there are these hidden economies of care which enable this migration to take place in the first place. So back at the homes, you see, this is actually the villages where I lived in Jharkhand, where, people from every household are migrating for a part of the year. But back at home, what enables them to go in the first place and return back to their homes are the fact that they do have these homes. They have people who are looking after their, either elderly, these are two kind of grandparents. I know she's feeding her grandchild. That's another story. But you have these, you have people at home, grandparents, or a person in the household who's looking after the cattle, who's looking after the fields, who's keeping your house running while you go off and migrate. So when they're migrating, they can't actually do the work they are doing migrating if there's not somebody back to receive them. And so what we're talking about is like looking at the households, looking at the kinship relations that enable this migration to take place. And this is what we're calling, the hidden economies of care that sustain this migration, and looking at how these households get divided across time and across space through the migration process. So to analyze all this, what we gain real inspiration from is two kinds of debates. And one is like old migration debates, which Jens is going to talk about. And the other is feminist debates from the 60s, which really highlighted that, when we think about the economy, or we always think about production and the work that men do in the factories, but what about the work that goes on in the households, the domestic labor that enable people to work outside of that household? We never count that as work. We never count that as labor, and we never value it, right? So that work is never paid, the work that goes into sustaining a household. And that is a hidden form of exploitation, which never gets realized. And so feminists have long been highlighting this. Some of you might remember the old wages for housework campaigns, where feminists were arguing for, we need wages for the housework that we do in the home, because without that, there would be no economy, right? And so what we do in this paper is look at those old debates and what they teach us about these hidden economies, what we call the hidden economies of care. But you could also use the debates that the terms that feminists use these days, which is social reproduction theory. And what we're looking at is like how the processes of inequality that are spreading around the world must involve an analysis of what's happening in the household, the battle for the household and the community, and looking at how production and reproduction can't be separated, how the economy can't be separated from kinship, and how an analysis of the economy has to delve right into the household. So we're using all of this analysis to think about this process of internal seasonal labor migration. Over to Jens.
And another thing we returned to were some other half-forgotten debates from the 1970s. They were interesting because they were from the global south and they related to seasonal migration. It was people like the anthropologist Claude Meillassoux and others that showed for example, from South Africa, that circular labor migration actually was in the interest of capital. And they did that by, for example, looking at the South African mining sector, where they could show that it actually profited quite dramatically from using extremely cheap labor from the subsistence economies of the African periphery. The reason was that they could externalize the cost of reproduction from the wages. They didn't have to pay for that because that could be paid for by the household economy of the laborers back home in their villages. So it was the villages, the household, the clan, etc., that would provide for them if they were unemployed, if they were sick, when they were old, for their family reproduction over generation. It was them and not as part of the wages from the employer that would be paid. So, for example, Meillassoux called that super exploitation of migrant laborers. You could exploit them more than wage workers that had to also be paid for their reproductions through their own wages.
So we've basically highlighted, the main things we're looking at in this paper, which is the fact that we've got to look at how this labor is made really, really, really cheap to enable, economies to profit so much from it, and by not valuing the labor that they put in. And so seasonal labor migration is we've got to think about what's happening back in the households, what's enabling this migration to take place, the spatial temporal division of households, and we've got to look at the land and the forests which enable them to sustain the households back in the villages, apart from the work that goes on inside the household. And what we're saying in this paper is that making these economies of care invisible is what allows employers, whether it's in factories, whether it's in brick kilns or construction sites, to steal the value of the workers and their households. It's what makes them so cheap to employ. And so any kind of project of tackling inequality has to value this labor properly. And I'm going to hand over to Jens for the very last slide about what the implications of all of this.
Thanks. Yes, because we of course also looked at what to do about this. What is practical political implications of this? The obvious one would be to go to the government of India and suggest improvements in the legal framework to protect workers. Sadly, whatever legal framework there is in place isn't being used, and labor laws are being rolled back even further these days. So it doesn't seem that has much purchase. Another approach could be that seasonal migrants could organize themselves and fight for their rights. And it does happen, but that is also a very uphill struggle because they are against what the interest of the government is, what the interest of the employers are, and sadly also what the interest of other laborers who they undercut are. So they are up against quite some odds. And of course, all these approaches are really limited to production-based. And we've just argued that there's more to this than the production, there's also the reproduction. So proper demands, proper ways of dealing with that would involve looking at how to also value reproduction work. And here there's the wages for housework idea. There's of course the universal basic income idea, and there are also in India programs that relates more to what goes on in the villages, such as affirmative action and the rural employment guarantee. But so far, very little has happened in this area as well. One could also go for even bigger changes, so that people didn't have to migrate, improve the economy back home, or maybe even systemic change. What we have done in our work is to work with the ILO and with organizations on the ground, and trying to, at least as a first step, to get recognized that there is such a thing as structural discrimination of migrants and other workers in India and elsewhere. And we have that we think is a major step forward, that the International Labour Organization now recognizes that that is the case. And we hope that that can help organizations working on the ground to improve the laws, that this is now being brought out in the open, that this is an issue. So that is as much as we've got time for now. Thanks.
I just add one last thing. It looks, we've presented to you a very research from a very, very in-depth fieldwork conducted over a year in a particular country. But in fact, the implications are kind of global, because these processes are happening everywhere. And what's great about the ILO paper, the ILO report that we worked on with colleagues at the UN ILO, is that it's showing, how these processes are happening, not just in South Asia, but also in the Middle East, and providing a framework for thinking about this in many countries, including, it can be used here as well in England.